This is Ben May, and I want to welcome you as we continue to seek the old paths. I tell you, we have a challenge in front of us tonight, and I encourage you to take your study guide and turn to page 193, and we'll start there in just a minute or two. Tell you this part of our study is fast coming to an end. We have traced the children of Israel from their captivity in Egypt down to Mount Sinai, and then up to where they are now on the plains of Moab, getting ready to enter into the promised land. But now, we have come, though, in our Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy. And there's 34 chapters in Deuteronomy. And here we are going to cover those all at one time. And of course, as you would guess, that would be an overview. But let me pause a minute, though, and I want to encourage you that if you have not yet ordered your copy of our new study guide that we will start, Lord willing, in just a couple of weeks or so, 2 or 3 weeks, then why not just take that phone number, that email address, or that mailing address and just write in and ask for it or call, and we'll get these out to you. Brother Billy Carter will see to it that you get one. And I think you'll be glad that you did. This guide is 133 pages. It's like a commentary, you might say. And it's called In the Days of the Judges, the Conquest of the Land and the Period of the Judges. See, they're getting ready now to go in to conquer the land. And so our next study naturally will start there. And so do that if you would. And I think you'll enjoy the study even more. Now, back to our study for tonight. We're seeking the old paths where the good way is. And we'll find that Moses over and over and over is going to appeal to the people to do that very thing, not in those words that Jeremiah used in chapter 6 and verse 16, but with the same kind of appeal to stick to God's ways. And we'll see that. Now, you think about Deuteronomy. If you have your Bibles and you see that's sort of an unusual term. When's the last time you said Deuteronomy in the course of a conversation, unless you were referring back to this book in the Bible? It's just not a word we use, is it? But it means second law, or repetition of the law. That's one reason we can do an overview, I think, of it, not do it too much of an injustice. It's a book of reviews. And what it consists of is there are 3 speeches that Moses is going to give. And so as you look at your Bible and you think about these 34 chapters, predominantly, it's just that, 3 speeches. Now, a lot of it is repetition. We've covered it before. There's some new details in there. The end of the book, we find Moses dying. That's a sad time. Moses has been with us, hasn't he, since they left Canaan, and after the 40-year wandering and such. But here we are, and this is Moses' final appeal to the people. He wants them, he wants them to be faithful. It's really what the stress is. So let's get into our study now and see if we can hit the highlights and think about Moses. Again, keep in mind, Moses is 120 years old, but he's still in good shape. But he knows his time is short, and his final words. Now, what would you say if you had been a leader of a people for some 40 years, and this is your last chance to talk to them? And so as the book of Deuteronomy opens up, it's the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year since the Israelites left Egypt. And again, they're camped in the plains of Moab. And so Moses, again, before he dies, he wants to warn the people to be faithful. Remember that the old generation who rebelled back at Kadesh Barnea, they're dead now. In fact, they renumbered the people, and sure enough, the only 2 of the original group that was numbered at Mount Sinai, only Joshua and Caleb survived that, and that's as the Lord said it would be. And so, although this is a new generation, there still be many there who were old enough to remember their slavery and the plagues that God sent upon the Egyptians and the great events of the last 40 years. And so it is a reminder of sorts, but it's also something that, again, he's saying to a new generation. And so his first speech then, it could be summed up, I suppose, by saying, he says, now don't be afraid, remain faithful. Don't be afraid, remain faithful. And so he reminds them that God has spoken to them at Horeb, or Mount Sinai. And God told them to go and take the land that He had promised to their fathers. But He also reminds them of the sin at Kadesh Barnea. Remember, the people request that spies be sent into the land. They're initially, now they've left Egypt, and they've stopped at Mount Sinai for almost a year. And just shortly after that, they come up to Kadesh Barnea as if we're going right on in, take the land. They sent spies in, 12 spies. They come back. It's a wonderful land, but 10 say we can't take it. Why? They're too powerful for us. We're like grasshoppers in their sight, and they're giants in the land. 2 said, we can do it. God's for us. And that was Joshua and Caleb. Unfortunately, the people sided with the 10. And God's punishment for their lack of belief and faith in Him was that they would wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation that rebelled had died. And so that's what they do. They wander for 40 years until now here they are at the end of that time ready to go in. And Moses is just reminding them. Now, he says, now let's think about this. Moses explained that God had not allowed them to take some land, and other land He's going to allow them to take. But think about He's not allowing them to take the Edomite land. They're descendants of Esau. Or the Moabites, they're descendants of Lot. Or the Ammonites, also descendants of Lot. See, God had given these people their land, and they had giants in it that they had to overcome. And so He said, don't be afraid of the giants. And Moses just said, now you remember that God has given you those 2 Amorite kings in the plains of Moab, and you remember King Sihon and King Og, and in fact King Og himself was a giant. His bed was 13.5 feet, 6 feet wide. And so that land, remember, was divided between Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh. And yet the spies had been afraid of the giants in the fortified cities. And yet God had given a land of giants to Edom and to Moab and to Ammon. Now why did they think they'd be any different? They took their land, and God helped them to take the land on the side of the Jordan that they're currently on the right side, the east side. So the message was, now don't fear, don't fear. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 7. Moses says, for what great nation is there that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon Him? And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments, as are in all this law, which I set before you this day? Only take heed to yourself, and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. And teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. So Moses reminds them now that while they should not be afraid, but he won't be going with them. In fact, he says in Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 23, then I pleaded with the Lord, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. So the Lord said to me, enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter. I imagine Moses dropped it after that, didn't he? Moses also reminds him of their sin at Baal Peor, when they committed fornication with the women of Moab and of Midian. He warned them about idolatry because the land in which they're going, well, they worship idols too. And they need to be careful. And so all through chapter 4, over and over, God through Moses is saying, like in chapter 4, verse 1, now, O Israel, listen to the statutes. Verse 2, you shall not add to the word, nor take from it. I'll tell you, religious-minded people, we need to think about that today, don't we? Don't add to the word, don't take from it. And verse 6 of chapter 4, be careful to observe them. And verse 9, take heed and diligently keep yourself. Verse 15, take careful heed to yourselves. And verse 23, take heed to yourselves. You see that theme, don't you? That concern. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 39. Therefore know this day, and consider it in your heart, that the Lord Himself is God in heaven above, and on the earth beneath. There is no other. You shall therefore keep His statutes and His commandments, which I command you today, that it may be well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. Notice a familiar theme. You think about the verse we've often quoted, Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16. Ask for the old paths, where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. He's saying, why you listen to the Lord, you obey Him, that it may be well with you and with your children after you, and you may prolong your days, and so on. And so do you see the thrust of that first speech? Shorter speech, but it's don't be afraid. Just be faithful to God. Now, the second speech has much more of a warning tone to it. You beware, lest you forget to obey the Lord. Now, this second speech is from Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 44. And then it goes down through chapter 11. And so Moses, in this second speech now, he's reminding Israel of the covenant God made with them at Mount Sinai. He reminded them how God spoke to them and how they feared His voice. Remember that in our study previously? When we say the Ten Commandments, they're very important. Those are the ones that God spoke Himself out loud. And the children of Israel, it scared them to death. They heard it all right, but it scared them. And so now Moses reminds them of that, and now he reviews those. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 10, he says, now when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which He swore to your fathers, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of all good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. When you have eaten and are full, then beware, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. There's a danger in prosperity, isn't it? Especially when you didn't have to work for it. And Moses says, you be careful, because you are going to inherit a wonderful land. It's there. It's there for the taking, because God's going to give it to you. But don't let that, the very blessing that God's given you, end up being a curse to you. And so Moses reminds Israel, don't tempt God like they did in some of the instances, like at Meribah. When the people complained, saying, give us water to drink, back in Exodus chapter 17. Why, they tempted the Lord, said, well, is the Lord among us or not? And said, we're going to test the Lord here while we're thirsty. And we're going to see if the Lord is here or not. Now, Lord, you give me some water, so I'll believe you. No, you don't tempt the Lord like that. You don't put God to the test. Moses reminded Israel that they were a holy nation, chosen by God. The very title of our work guide, remember, you shall be my people. But they were to be a holy people. He warned them, don't you intermingle with the Canaanites. In fact, when you get into this promised land, you destroy everything there as far as the idols and the altars. And you make no covenants with them. In fact, He doesn't even want them to allow any of them to stay in the land. Kill them, run them off, whatever it takes. Don't marry them. And God says, let me tell you, there are 7 nations that we're going to dispossess here. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And don't think now somehow God is mistreating these people. Remember back in Genesis chapter 15, when God was saying to Abraham, I'm going to give you and your descendants this wonderful land, the very land now that they're getting ready to take. But He said, not now. In fact, it would not be for over 400 years. Why? God said to Abraham, because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. God was still giving this people time to turn back to Him, but they didn't. And so now God is running them out of their land. Now all these 7 nations were the descendants of Ham. Remember who Ham was? There were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those were the 3 sons of Noah. Ham is the one that his descendants, there was a curse placed upon them. Cursed be Canaan, the son of Ham. And it was said they'd be servants. Well, here we find the fulfillment of that, at least in part, if not altogether, where these nations now, the descendants of Ham, are going to be either killed or put in servitude. Now, Moses says, God is just not asking you to serve Him for nothing. God wants to bless you. You should be my people, God says. But you've got to obey God. God to keep His covenant. He'll bless you. He'll multiply you. He'll bless your children. He'll bless your crops, your livestock. He'll take away your sickness. He'll deliver you from your enemies and so on. But it says now you've got to remember God when He blesses you. In chapter 8, verse 11, He says, beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments. And down in verse 18, He says, remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth. I tell you, I just have to pause a minute. I think sometime in this land of plenty that we live in, sometimes we just think, well, I've done this. I've got my education, I've got my job, I've done that. You remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth. You could have been born not able to make a living. You could be sick and disabled. You could not live in this land at all. There's any number of things that could be very different circumstances in your life. We need to be thankful to the God of heaven. So in Deuteronomy chapter 8, in verse 19, He said, then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. We are concerned about our own nation, aren't we? Because as a nation, we are not seeking the old past. The Bible says that sin is a reproach to any people. And we need to be careful. I don't know how long God will tolerate a nation as it drifts further and further away from Him. The Israelites were warned, don't you forget God, lest the blessings stop and the curses follow. And so Moses sort of reminds them about their rebellions. They had plenty to be reminded of. And he says, you just think about all the rebellious times you've had. You need to be reminded, God is not giving this land to you because you're such a fine person. You're such a great and righteous nation. No. He's given you this land because of who God is and because of His promises He made back to Abraham. But He said, now remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord. Why, from the day you left Egypt until you've come here. And He names off from Mount Horeb to Taberah, to Massa, to Kadesh Barnea, and the other places that could be mentioned. Now, in the second speech, sort of a second main theme to it, was He goes back over much of the law. Now, we're not going to go over this in detail. Time just would not permit. We've gone over it before. But they needed to be reminded. Remember, this is a new generation. And part of their obedience to God, a big part of it, was keeping the law, the old law, the law of Moses. And so He reminds them of God's laws, and He talks a lot of specifics here. But they can be broken down into various categories. For instance, there's laws for the congregation. As a group, you might say. They were to be a holy people. Don't pollute yourself. And He says, now who can be a part of this assembly? Who cannot be a part? And there's got to be cleanness in the camp, because God ventures in and out of the camp in some special way. But then there's laws for the individual. As a Jew, if I were a Jew, I'd have to give my tithes to the Lord. I'd have to sacrifice in the place where He tells me to. I'd have to set apart my firstborn. I'd have to redeem my firstborn, in fact. And if I had a rebellious son, then there was even to the extreme case of having that son had to be stoned to death. As a Jew, I would not be allowed to engage in some detestable or inappropriate behavior. And I've got to show consideration to other people, both to people and to animals even. And so there was much of a common sense approach, and then there were those things that we just wouldn't have thought of, but God said, here's what I want you to do. And then what about when we go to war? Well, there were rules for going to war. I thought that was interesting. There are rules for war. And even provisions made. What if you're afraid? Then maybe you don't have to go. What if you've just gotten married? What if you just built a house? There were occasions where you'd be excused from war. Talked about the cities of refuge. We sort of hurriedly went over that before. But there were those places set up for your protection if you accidentally kill someone. And then Moses says, I want you to remember the Amalekites, because they ambushed us on the way up from after we left Egypt, God's going to go back and execute judgment on the Amalekites. And we'll see that on over in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And then there were the laws, they were reminded of the laws for uncleanness, because the camp had to be kept clean. They told again about some things about leprosy. What do you do if you have leprosy? Talked about marriage. Marriage is so important. And what happens if your husband says, you've been unfaithful, or either I married this woman, she wasn't a virgin, and they were laws for that. What happens if I'm in battle and I find a woman that I really like and I want this foreign woman to be my wife? Well, there were some rules for that. What if a person commits adultery? Well, they were to be stoned to death, but there were rules about that. What if she were single, or what if she were married, and what if it was out in the country, or what if it was in town, and so on. And then there were those special times of the year that they were to observe. There was the 7th year when many of the debts would be forgiven. There were the feast days that they were to remember. There were the Thanksgiving offerings that they were to make. Then he says, now, you're getting into this land and you are a nation and you're going to be interacting with other people. So there are various laws for crimes, just like we have today, different laws, but same principle. Things about murder, about kidnapping, about even temple prostitutes. If somebody turns to idolatry, they're to be stoned to death. The guilty person is to die. But he says, now, if someone is executed, you don't just leave them out in the body out in the open. You bury that person. Don't pollute the land, and you just don't go there. And then property. They're going to inherit this land, and the land's going to be divided, and they've got their property, they've got their livestock, and so the laws about their livestock and about their rights, even in their neighbors' property, and the boundary markers, and all those kind of things had to be dealt with, and Moses goes over those. And then he talked about even laws for those in service. Well, what about a runaway slave? They had slavery back in that day. Not the same type that probably pops into our mind. Most often, a slave was because of war or some debt a person owed. And what if some slave runs away? Or what if it's a hired man? All the ins and outs of those kind of things. You got to have judges. What kind of judges? He said, you get judges that will be honest and fair. And then he mentions something in the second speech. He talks about kings. But it's going to be a few hundred years before they ask for a king. And yet God said, one day you will. And here are the guidelines for your king. Unfortunately, they didn't follow those guidelines once they did get a king. And it came back to haunt them, just as God said that it would. And then he goes back over offerings for Levites and the priest. But it's also an interesting prophecy that one day God would raise up a prophet like unto Moses. Him you'll listen to. And our New Testament says that that's talking about Christ. Well, you're going about and you're doing business. Well, there are laws for dealing with other people. You've got to use accurate weights and measures, for instance. And you don't charge interest to your brother, especially your poor brother. You keep your vows and various regulations like that. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 26 and verse 16, this day the Lord your God commands you to observe these statutes and judgments with all your heart and with all your soul. Also today the Lord has proclaimed you to be His special people, just as He promised you, that He will set you high above all nations which He has made in praise and name and in honor, and that you may be a holy people to the Lord your God, just as He has spoken. You see the care and the concern here. Moses wants these people to do well, to be faithful. And that's his point now as he's talking to them in these last speeches. So, the first speech, do not be afraid, remain faithful. The second speech, beware lest you forget to obey the Lord. The third speech now, that we'll very quickly look at, is there are blessings and curses that are set before the people. Very interesting how they did this. And they literally, you might say, set those blessings and curses before the people. Now, they're getting ready again to go into the promised land. And they're over the Jordan on Mount Ebal, and they were to set up these great stones covered with plaster. And on these great stones covered with plaster to write all the words of the law. And they were also to build an altar and offer burnt offerings and peace offerings. Now, there were two mounts, and you see on your map here, they're designated here. There was Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Half the people were to stand at Mount Gerizim and the other half by Mount Ebal. And what they were to do is that on one mount they would give the blessings, and the other mount they give the curses. And so in verse 1 it says, now those who diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all His commandments. And that's the key. But then in verse 15 it says, notice who the curses were pronounced upon. Those who do not obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all His commands and statutes. They might think, well, I just don't understand why I've got to do all these rules and regulations. Because God said so. You are His special people. You are a holy people. And this is part of you remaining that holy people. The choice is yours. You obey or you don't obey. They would determine whether they would be blessed or whether they would be cursed. Isn't it that way today to a large extent? I'm glad that we don't live under the old law. But the choice is ours to obey or not to obey. And he goes through many things now. Oh, they would be blessed and essentially everywhere. In the city, in the country, their crops, their livestock, their storehouses, whatever they put their hand to, they would be blessed because they are obedient to the Lord. Their enemies would be defeated. But what if they're unfaithful? Why, you'll be cursed. Just as you were blessed everywhere, so you'll be cursed everywhere. Why, God would send plagues, consumption, fever, inflammation, the sword, blight, mildew, heat, drought, wind, all the bad things everything that can go wrong will go wrong if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Your enemies will come along finally and they'll defeat you. You won't be able to stand up against them. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 26, your carcasses will be food for all the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and no one shall frighten them away. The Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt, with tumors, with the scab, with the itch, with which you cannot be healed, with madness and blindness and confusion of heart. And you shall grope at noonday, as a blind man gropes in the darkness. You shall not prosper in your ways. You shall be only oppressed and plundered continually, and no one will save you. Pretty bleak picture, isn't it? And so it goes, as God through Moses is trying to drive home the point. You just don't know how bad it can be if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God. 49, the Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly, nor show favor to the young, and they shall eat the increase of your livestock and the produce of your land until you are destroyed. They shall not leave your grain or new wine or oil or the increase of your cattle or the offspring of your flocks until they have destroyed you. Sadly, that very thing happens when Nebuchadnezzar comes and delivers the final blow to the nation of Judah, a nation that they do not understand their language, and they are destroyed, and a small remnant taken off into captivity. And so they are warned, if you don't obey, you'll be scattered around all the earth. And so they make a covenant, they renew their covenant with God, a promise to keep those commandments, lest those curses come upon them. Moses now, he knows it's time. He says, now Joshua's going to lead you in my place. He encourages them again to be strong. He says every 7 years you read every word of the law. And so Moses and Joshua, they go to the tabernacle where God appeared in the pillar of cloud. And God says to Moses that Israel one day would become unfaithful. And he tells Moses to teach them a song to remind them of all these things. And God says to Joshua, in chapter 31 and verse 23, be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land of which I swore to them, and I will be with you. And so they go up, and Moses says his final goodbyes to the people. He blesses them, and then he praises God. He climbs up to the top of Mount Pisgah, and God shows him the land flowing with milk and honey, and then Moses dies, and God buries him near Beth Peor. He died with good eyesight and vigor, and the children of Israel weep for him for 30 days. And then Joshua is filled with the spirit of wisdom, And Israel listens to Joshua, and they obey his voice. There never again arose a prophet like Moses. God knew Moses face to face. Never again would man be able to make that claim. Thank you for being with us. Join us next time as we continue to seek the old paths.